Okay. Welcome everyone to another meeting of the Online Peace Science Colloquium. I'm Brad Smith. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University, and I co-organize this colloquium with Chelsea Estancona, who's an assistant professor at the University of South Carolina. If you're tuning in for the first time, we're affiliated with the Peace Science Society, and our goal with this online seminar series is to bring the great research that happens at the Peace Science Society's annual meeting to you all year in your home, office, on a beach, wherever you might be at the given time. So today we're really excited to have a great paper and a great panel of discussants to talk about the paper. The paper is going to be presented by Chamseul Yu, who's a PhD student at Texas A&M. The paper is titled, topic that's near and dear to my heart, Alliances, Great Power Rivalry, and the Cost of Deterrence. We have an excellent panel of discussants. We have Jesse Johnson, who's an associate professor of political science at Kentucky. We have Michael Kenwick, associate professor of political science at Rutgers, Roseanne McManus, associate professor at Penn State, and Ashley Leeds, who's a professor of political science at Rice University. For the format, I'll turn it over now to Chamseul. We'll have a short presentation of the paper, then we'll have a little bit of discussant comments, and then we'll have an open conversation about the paper. So Chamseul, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today. I am Chamseul Yu, the third-year PhD student in Texas A&M University. And I'm sorry, I don't know why, but my camera doesn't work, so I'm gonna be freeze most of the time. So please understand that. I'm gonna present the paper titled "Alliances, Great Power Rivalry, and Cost of Deterrence" today. So in this paper, I aim to investigate the effect of the great power alliances on the third party's behavior. And the behavior here is mostly about the cost of the alliances rather than the benefit. So this paper questions when and how does a potential challenger impose costs on the members of the rival alliances. I use linear probability models using data set of interstate conflict and economic sanctions from 1950 to 2010. And I found that a potential great power challenger is more likely to sanction and less likely to militarily threaten proteges of each great power rival than non-proteges when military capabilities of the proteges alliance camp are strong enough. So people usually think of the dyadic relations between challenger and target when study conflict, but the bringing concept of the alliances into the conflictual study makes this dyadic relations to the triadic relationships. So the main interest here is whether the challenger is more or less likely to initiate a conflict against a target when a target forms alliance with certain partners. But what if now the challenger is the great power and the target is the non-great power target, and there's another great power? This great power forms an alliance with a non-great power target. So now the great power and non-great power target turn to the patron and the protege. And also, what if the patron is the great power rival of the challenger? What happened? So what the challenger's reaction can be in this situation if the patron forms the patron is the rival of themselves, the rival of the challenger, and the patron forms alliance with the protege. So in 2016, South Korea and United States deployed the thought system into the South Korean territory. The thought system here is the missile defense system invented by the Lockheed Martin, and it contains like a huge range of the radar which can observe the military base in the China near the Korean Peninsula. So it can be the significant security threat to the China. So China imposed economic sanctions on the South Korea in response to the thought deployment of the South Korea and the United States. And also here, the United States, Japan, and South Korea's efforts for forming the trilateral military alliances and the bolstering the alliances made China mad. So main reaction of the China to that issue is the aggression. So why? this is the case. So if we apply this situation into the triangle we've seen before, the China is the challenger, and the United States is the patron, and the South Korea is the protege, because the United States and China forms alliance, and China is the United States rival. So in China's response to that is mostly about a threat. But however, the previous literature on alliance is mainly focused on the deterrence effect of the alliances. So one branch of this study argues that alliances at least sometimes deter military aggressions, but another branch argues that alliances do not deter military conflict in general. And of course, there are more nuanced studies have been conducted. So it's mainly about a great power or symmetric alliances and their deterrence effect. But what about the cost of the deterrence here? So this study lacks the explanation of the cost of the deterrence or cost of the alliances that the protege should pay under the certain situation, which is the great power rival between the potential challenger and the protege's patron. So what if patron of the great power alliance has a great power rival, for example, the United States and China? And in this situation, even if a great power alliance can deter conflict because the challenger may want to avoid the great power wars between a challenger and a patron, but the protege here may still have to pay some cost imposed by the challenger. So for example, the China imposed economic sanctions on South Korea in response to the THAAD deployment. And this the cost imposition behavior of the challenger, the reason of that behavior is really simple, because one country's military capabilities are other security concern. So this is the security dilemma. And of course, here the military capabilities are not limited to the single country's military capabilities, but can be extended to the sum of the military capabilities of all alliance members. So, and more importantly, this security concern would be severer when there is a rivalry between countries or rivalry between the alliance camp. So the challenger would be incentivized to weaken the rival alliance camps by imposing economic sanctions on a protege when the rival alliance's camp's military capabilities are strong enough to threat their own security. It's two reasons. Economic cost by the economic sanction can be translated into the political cost. So at the time when the China imposed economic sanctions on South Korea, there were many protests and political debates in the South Korea because against the THAAD deployment, because at that time South Korea thought like efforts for bolstering the military alliance with the United States can harm their national interest. So in this situation, the target leader should choose either sticking to the patron side or slightly moving to the challenger side. And this domestic backlash can be the political cost of the target leader. And also, a protege is not a major power. So for challenger, the protege is a lot easier counterparts compared to the patron. And also, sanctions are not the direct military conflict. So a challenger doesn't necessarily worry about the military intervention of the patron into this conflictual situation between the challenger and a protege. So therefore, I mean using economic sanctions, a challenger can weaken rival alliance, but avoiding risk of the severe conflict between a challenger and the patron at the same time. However, military threat is not the case. If you think about the nature of the defense pacts, if the nature of the defense pacts conflict between the challenger and a protege is not a bilateral conflict anymore, the patron is highly likely to engage into that conflict militarily. And also, if you think about a tension between the challenger and a patron, the probability of the escalation would be really, really high. So the probability that the conflict between a challenger and a protege escalates into the major power conflict or war between a challenger and a patron. So, which may not be the preferred by all actors here, the patron, challenger, and protege. So visually, it's really simple. In some, like if the military capability of the rival alliance camp really strong enough, boom, the great power challenger is more likely to impose economic sanctions on the protege, but less likely to pose a military threat to the protege for avoiding the possible escalation of the conflict into the major power war. So from this discussion, I generate two different hypotheses. First is the economic sanction hypothesis. A potential challenger is more likely to impose economic sanctions on a protege than non-protege when the military capability of the protege's alliance camp are strong enough or relative to the challenger's capability. And second is military threat hypothesis. It's really similar to economic sanction hypothesis, but the direction is different. So a potential challenger is less likely to pose a military threat to a protege than a non-protege when the military capability of the protege alliance camp is strong enough, and again, relative to the challenger's capabilities. The unit of analysis of testing is diet gear, but only where a potential challenger is a great power and a potential target is a minor power. And I just follow the classification of this major minor power of the Correlates of War project. So, and dependent variables are economic sanctions and low-level militarized interstate dispute. These are binary variables coded 1. When the challenger imposes economic sanctions on a target, will initiate a low-level meet to the target, respectively, 0 otherwise. And the independent variable or the first protege. Protege is the binary variable coded 1 when a potential target is the member of the defense pacts of a potential challenger's great power rival in a given year. Second is CAP-TC. CAP-TC here is the military capability of the target's alliance camp. So it's just a simple sum of the military capabilities of the all target's alliance partners. So if the target doesn't have any alliance, only the target's capabilities are considered as the value of the variable. Last is the probability of the target camp's probability of the winning against war against the challenger. So I just followed, I followed the Dr. Jesse Johnson's way to measure it in his 2015 ISQ paper. And these two variables are gonna be interacted with the protege. So I added the set of control variables, and I use linear probability models with year, challenger, and target fixed effects. So this is the model specification, and the most important part here is the interaction term between the protege and the military capability things, and also the beta 3. So I expected that beta 3 would be positive for economic sanctions, but negative for the low-level meet. Here's the result. The main independent variable in this table is target camp capability, not a relative sense. So model 1 to 3 are about economic sanctions, and 4 to 6 is about a low-level meet initiation. And as you can see, the interaction term between the protege, variable protege, and the military capability of the target camp are positively correlated with the economic sanctions, but negatively associated with the low-level meet. So this implies that as target camp's military capability increases, the challenger is more likely to impose economic sanctions on a protege than non-protege, but less likely to initiate the low-level meet for avoiding the possible escalation into the major power war. This is the marginal effect plot. So as you can see here, around point 2, the marginal effects of the protege on economic sanctions turn to positive, and marginal effect of the protege on low-level meet turn to negative. So this result might imply that above this point, the challenger may perceive the military capability of the target camp as their security threat. So the challengers are more likely to impose economic sanctions on a protege for weakening the target camps, weakening the rival alliance camp, but less likely to initiate the low-level meet for avoiding the possible major war or conflict, kind of this. And this is another result using different independent variable here, target's probability of winning. So it's more about a relative sense of the military capability. So similar to above, the interaction term between protege and target camp's probability of winning the war against the challenger are positively associated with the economic sanctions, but negatively associated with the low-level meet. So this implies that as the challenger's probability of winning decreases, the challenger is more likely to impose economic sanctions on a target, on a protege, but less likely to initiate the low-level meet against the protege. So again, the marginal effect plot. And interestingly, the marginal effects of protege on economic sanctions and low-level meet turn to positive and negative, respectively, at the really similar point, which is 0.5. Like, it's 50-50 chance of winning or losing. So above that point, the challenger is more likely to, above that point, the challenger may think that, oh, the target's camp, the military capability of the target camp is really significant, so it can be the significant security threat of the challenger. So the challenger is more likely to impose economic sanctions on a protege for weakening rival alliance camp, but less likely to initiate a low-level meet again. So this is it. So here's the conclusion. A challenger would impose economic sanctions on protege to weaken the rival alliance when the protege's line camp is militarily capable enough, which means that protege should pay something for deterrence or the alliance. But this also means that proteges faces dilemma. So this forming and bolstering the alliance capability is for their own security, but their effort for doing that can incur certain economic costs if the patron has the great power rival, if the challenger and a patron, the potential challenger and a patron or rival. And for a challenger, economic sanctions and low-level military threat are substitute policy rather than the complementary. So yeah. Yeah, I think that's it. That's it for today.
Great, thanks, Chamseul. So if you could remove the share screen, and then we'll move to the discussion. So so the way that we'll structure this is we're going to ask each of the discussants to sort of hit the high points that they want to make sure we get to. Take about 5 minutes each. Let's go in alphabetical order by last name. So we'll start with you, Jesse.
Thank you. I guess going first, I should probably keep my comments short and make sure there's enough to say for the other discussants. I was thinking if I go last, what am I going to say? So I'll try to be respectful to everybody else and leave things to discuss for them. But I first want to say is this is a great paper. It's very well written. This is very strong writing for a graduate student. And the presentation's very good too. You're a very good presenter. I would be very nervous if I was in your shoes at your stage. And so you didn't show any nerves and you gave a great presentation. So very job well done. My comments are mostly theoretical. I think I'll push you on the mechanism that's underlying these associations you're finding in the data and your argument. It seems to be you're focused on security concerns, and I'm not sure that's as obvious as you think it is, because when we think about these major power, minor power alliances, a lot of people think about them as the minor power, the protege, not necessarily providing capabilities or security to the rival. So what is it that the foreign power is actually scared of here? And then also a lot of the alliances are defensive, right? Even your example of South Korea and THAAD, all that's defensive, right? And so the question then becomes like, why is this provoking this foreign power to take these actions. I will give a nod to our host here, Brad Smith. He has a great paper with Brett Benson that does show that these types of dynamics could create security concerns for the target of the alliance. But a lot of that is due to commitment problems, and the concern happens before the alliance arrives, right? And so I'm wondering if your argument's more about an anticipation of alliances rather than the formation of the alliances. Then the question then comes for me is like, well, what's the goal of all of this for the rival power once the alliance is formed? Is it you seem to think it's to weaken the alliance, and potentially that's one logic. But if we go back to the idea that these are defensive and they're not really concerned about the capabilities of the smaller power, that might be less less defensible of an argument. And then also what's missing from this is you seem to think that this might not only weaken the alliance, but also end the alliance. A competing logic would suggest that this would tell the minor power that we're doing the right thing. We really need to be part of this alliance, because if we were on our own, this might be even worse. And so I would like to see you talk about some of those dynamics. The last thing I'll say is you didn't talk much about selection effects, but I think those actually work in your favor, because I think the selection effect that I'd be most concerned about is states knowing if they form this alliance with somebody that they're going to be sanctioned or hurt by their new allies' rivals. And so that might make it less likely that we ever observe states that then form alliance and then get sanctioned, because they would just avoid that alliance altogether. So I just think thinking through some of these theories, making it a little tighter, would go a long way. So hopefully I've left plenty for my other discussants to talk about, but those are my key points. But job well done.
Thanks, Jesse. Okay, so now, Michael, if you want to jump in.
Sure, and I just want to echo that this was terrific. I remember doing a peace science colloquium when I was a grad student and being terrified, and I think it came across with me. It did not come across with you if you were. It was a terrific presentation. I'm actually going to rearrange my comments slightly to build off of a point that Jesse had just made, because I was wondering similarly with the argument that these sanctions are put to weaken the alliance. I was thinking, well, on the one hand, is that really unexpected for the country that just formed the alliance? They might have anticipated it, and as Jesse pointed out, that might vindicate the formation of the alliance. And then I was wondering, well, maybe they threatened the sanctions before the alliance to try to prevent it from being formed, and then their hands are tied and they have to implement it. And so it's not necessarily trying to weaken the alliance, but then to show potentially others that, there's this cost and we will follow through with our threats. But broader on the question of does it work, which I was wondering about, your argument to me would seem to imply that there are relationships with alliance termination, although I think that's a high bar to reach. But you might also look at what the effect of the sanctions might be long-term. Does it reduce the proportion of DCAs signed in the region? Is it meant as a deterrent to other states not to form alliances, or they'll incur the costs? Does it have any effect on leader visits? So if you're right that these sanctions are trying to, in the long term, impose costs and stop the country from doing other things, other ways of deepening ties, well, do we see it? That would be an interesting follow-on, I think. From a theoretical perspective, there were a few areas where I just wanted a little bit more detail. So you talk a little bit about how alliances will increase the costs of war and the risks of escalation, but there's also work out there, and I'll let Jesse and Ashley talk about this, but that could actually restrain escalation from the target side, because if I then respond to a low-level mid as the target by attacking, that could violate the terms of the alliance, and I might not want that, right? So I could also see a logic whereby the risk of escalation could be lower. I don't think this is a problem for you. I think there are different ways you can go about it, but just getting into the weeds a little bit more. And one of the things alliances might do beyond the costs would be clarifying the likely participants of a conflict. So it can actually deter by reducing the risk of mutual optimism, which I think would also be consistent with your argument, but not necessarily flow through costs. So just digging into that a little bit more, I think would be interesting. The logic with relative capabilities in the interaction term didn't quite come through to me. That when I got to the empirics is a little bit of a surprise, because I was thinking, well, the protégés just formed an alliance with a major power. Of course there's going to be a huge shift. Why do we need this knock-on interaction term? And I think there are reasons for that, but I think, again, digging into those weeds might be helpful for me. And then also, why is this limited to great powers? I could see this logic operating in regional rivalries as well, which might be another interesting way to develop the theory. And then just I'll wrap up with a few notes on methodologically. I thought you did a very nice job there, and I don't have any qualms, but just some ideas that you might be able to play around with. So you could look at, there's this interesting software and approach, Panel Match, which is a combination of differences in matching, which is actually very easy to implement. But a nice thing for you is that it can, if there are selection problems, and I think Jesse is right, that it might actually work in your favor, but you could control for kind of the prior set of relations and look at the effect of alliances, both on sanctions and disputes, 5 years on, 10 years on, 20 years on, to see what the timing looks like. And my gut is that will work in your favor. I don't think that will change your results, but it might go a long way in addressing some of the typical causal inference questions that we always have. And then the other small methods point, which again I think would be an easy implementation. There's a really nice piece by Hein Mueller and his co-authors on interaction terms of testing for nonlinearity and the interactive effects, which would be kind of another pretty straightforward and implementable thing to do, just to make sure that there aren't any kind of complex dependencies in the relationship between relative capabilities. But again, this was a terrific piece to read. I think it's very far along, very close to being ready to send out. And so it was a pleasure to read.
Thanks, Michael. We'll keep going in alphabetical order. So Ashley, if you want to jump in.
Thanks so much. So I want to say there were a few things that I really appreciated about this paper that I think are really steps in the right direction. First one is I really appreciate the focus on substitutable foreign policy possibilities, right? Thinking that we're not thinking about just one possible foreign policy tool, but the trade-off between foreign policy tools. I also like the focus on the protege as a meaningful actor who's thinking about these kinds of trade-offs. And when we think about this sort of, I assume the motivation here was, as you described, sort of China, US, and how Asian powers are managing this. A lot of that discussion around hedging takes that situation as unique, when in fact, I think you're thinking about this in a much more broader perspective about how do small powers in general think about the consequences of aligning with one side rather than not aligning with one side. This is not a new thing that's happening in Asia today. Belgium, for instance, experienced this throughout the first half of the 20th century, thinking about, what are the consequences to me of joining these alliances for my further policy. So I have two main big picture comments that I wanted to make. The first one is, and I think it's reflected not only in the paper, but in the reading of the paper and the panel therefore chosen, which is the dependent variable here is economic sanctions, right? So one of the dependent variables is militarized conflict, but really this is a story about states choosing economic sanctions. And yet there's really very little discussion of a theory of the dependent variable, economic sanctions. And of course, we don't have sanctions experts here on the panel. We have alliance experts on the panel, right? But I think really the paper would be strengthened by thinking through why is it that you impose economic sanctions and how and what effects are those likely to have? For instance, I think there's some assumptions here, which is that there won't be retaliation to sanctions, that sanctions are not escalatory, that sanctions alienate the population from their own government or the cause of the sanctions rather than the sanctioner, right? And I don't think any of those things are clear. And so some of the distinctions that you make theoretically between what will happen with a low-level mid versus what will happen with sanctions, I think could use some more defense and support. So that's my first comment, is I really think we need more about the dependent variable and the decision-making process about sanctions. The second point, and here I'm going to politely disagree with the good gentleman from Kentucky and the good gentleman from Rutgers, my good friends, that I think that thinking about the motivators of alliance formation is important here when you're distinguishing between proteges and non-proteges. I think that what Michael and Jesse said, that the idea that they may anticipate the sanctions, that I think is one possible selection effect. But here's the other one. You have to assume, if I'm thinking about sort of the hedging context in Asia, everybody's aware that they're trying to balance China and the US, right? Who's more likely to form formal alliances with the US? People who feel a greater threat. And that's likely to be states that, for example, may have a territorial conflict with China. And so what we'll see is that states who may have already had a more contentious relationship with the other great power might be more likely to become proteges in spite of these potential costs. And I think that's something that you really need to grapple with in the study. And so to the extent that you are centering the protege, think not only about what happens once they're in the camp, but why they got into that camp in the first place, and think about what you can do to convince us that these responses from the great power are kind of, an unexpected bad thing for them, rather than a good thing, given what might have happened if they weren't in the alliance. So thanks so much. As I said, I think it's a great direction for research. Good job.
All right, thanks, Ashley. Roseanne, if you want to jump in.
Okay, thank you. Well, I really enjoyed reading this paper. It was very interesting. As others have said, it's much more common to think about the benefits of joining an alliance, but I think it's also useful to think about the costs. And so this paper is refreshing in that respect. It's also an interesting way of bringing the sanctions and alliance literature together. And as others have said, the presentation was very smooth. So we've already gotten some great comments from other people. A lot has already been said about selection, so I think I won't say anything else about that. Mike already said a little bit about the theory about relative capabilities. I do just want to echo, I also found that to be rather under-theorized, and maybe not, to me, very intuitively plausible. I mean, it makes sense that a stronger alliance deters more, but I wasn't really sure why a weak alliance shouldn't deter at least a little bit. I mean, maybe you're using, the Kenwick and Vasquez argument, but I'm not really sure why one logic applies for weak alliances and other for strong. I would think the logic is the same logic, but just stronger for a stronger alliance. And likewise for the sanctions, I wasn't really following why the effect should actually change rather than just become stronger or weaker. And I think your argument might be that it shifts because they either do one or the other, but not both. But and I do like, that's good. I also like the foreign policy substitutability literature. It's good to dig into that. But why can't they do both? Why would they not, at least sometimes, choose to do both? So that was my thought on the theory. A few other smaller comments that others haven't mentioned yet. So again, along the lines of some of Mike's earlier research, you could look at the effect of joining an alliance versus being in an alliance. And you wouldn't even necessarily have to use matching. You could just have a dummy that for joining instead of just being a member. Jesse asked to theorize more about what they're afraid of. And I would guess in some cases, like the example you talked about, they're afraid of basing and like forward deployment of military capabilities. So I would think that distance would be a really important thing to at least control for and maybe make a part of your theory. It might also make sense to think about other things that the major power is sending besides the alliance, because actually your example was not about an alliance. South Korea has been an ally of the US for decades, but what made China angry was deployment of military equipment. So you might also want to look at that. And also, this overlaps with some other comments, but distinguish between cases where, or at least think about whether it's necessary to distinguish between cases where a country joins an alliance because they're particularly afraid of a challenger versus where they might join an alliance for another reason, but still provoke the challenger. So in South Korea's case, they primarily got this THAAD system because they're afraid of North Korea, but yet China got angry. But then there's going to be other cases where a country might ally with the US directly because they're afraid of China. I also wondered how much your measure of the military balance is correlated with the identity of the ally, because that could also be somehow affecting your results. So those are my major comments. And again, very interesting paper. Thank you.
Thanks, Roseanne. So we're good on time. So I have a few thoughts. So I want to echo what everyone else said. This is a really great paper. I think I hope that this is the core of what you plan to be your dissertation project, because as I read it, I was imagining like 3 or 4 other papers that could be written on this, and I think this is a really good way to push like, to me, that's a sign of a good paper. It's like it answered some questions, but it raised some other ones to me too. So I think this is really interesting and great presentation. So at first I want to pick up on. So it was heartening to me that Jesse made the comparison to this commitment problem logic, because I think one risk you run as a theorist that I often worry I'm doing is that you find this hammer and then everything looks like a nail. Because when I read the paper, I definitely did sort of have the same thought that Jesse had, which is, the paper sort of the theory had a dynamic flavor to it, right? Where I was asking myself, well, what is it that the target is worried about? They're worried about increases in coordination, arming, something like that. And they're using the sanctions potentially as a tool to decrease that risk in the future. So to build on this, I think one thing that kind of echoes some of the discussion about selection, and I think this is both something that is potentially a selection idea that you should sort of take into account, but also might provide an opportunity to have a more like an additional implication of this theory if in the course of thinking about this, you do think that the commitment problem sort of logic is driving some of this, is that when we think about commitment problems in the alliance context, an important scope condition with defensive alliances is that we should only expect sort of reactions from the target if they're revisionist, right? Because it's revisionist targets that would be worried about a defensive alliance. Because if you're happy with the status quo, you don't intend to challenge it, well, then a defensive alliance growing stronger isn't worrisome to you, right? But if you're unhappy with the status quo and you think that you're going to challenge in the future, an increase in arming from the defender to the protege is concerning to you. And that's exactly the kind of thing that I think in your story, you would want to use sanctions to maybe head off. So you could consider looking and seeing, if the effect you find is even stronger in observations where there's a revisionist target of the alliance. That would potentially be a nice test. A couple of other thoughts. So another idea, and I'll point back to a paper of Jesse's that I like that this reminded me of. So Jesse has this paper with Sam Bell that I think it's like one of my favorite empirical IR papers. And what they do is they actually test the Powell idea of shifting power. And so what they do is they measure states' expectations about how power is going to shift in the future. I think you could potentially do something similar, right? Because a couple of the discussants brought up this idea that maybe this is about alliance formation, right? And it's really, you would maybe expect to see this effect in anticipation of a new alliance. So you could think about doing something similar to what Jesse and Sam do in that paper, where you sort of try to estimate or measure in some way states' expectations about when a new alliance is going to occur. You could also do it with the kind of story that you're telling now, where I'm estimating that the defender is going to get stronger, and that causes me to today impose sanctions to hopefully prevent that from happening, right? Because that was sort of the story that I extracted from the theory, was that why would I want to do these sanctions? Well, it's to stop the alliance from becoming more of a problem for me as the target state. Right? The last thing that I'll say is that I think there's a couple of other papers that might be useful to think about in terms of the theory, which, you know, there were various comments about the theory. So one is my colleague Peter Schramm has a paper called Hassling. And that paper, I think the logic is sort of similar to how you're thinking of sanctions here. So the story there is, you know, if there's a power shift that I expect to occur, the classic way we think about stopping a power shift is with war, but states have all these other tools to try to stop power shifts, and sanctions is one. Sanctions is actually specifically a thing that Peter talks about in that paper as being an example of what he calls hassling, which are these lower than war actions that can be taken to slow a power shift. So that might be a useful you know, literature to engage with. Another thing that it reminded me of was Tim Crawford's work on wedge strategies, right? Because I think basically sanctions here are a wedge strategy, right? And he offers a typology, and sanctions is one of the kinds of things that he discusses. And so looking at that and kind of thinking about that might help to flesh out this idea that a few of the discussions brought up of what exactly is it that the sanctions are doing, right? Are they stopping the power shift? Are they increasing the cost for the protege? I'll stop here because I think we've got about 18 minutes left. So before we turn it over to an open discussion, so I'll say we have a few people in the audience. If you have some comments, add them to the chat, and if I'm able, I'll try to pass them along, and if not, I'll pass them along to Chamseul afterwards. But Chamseul, if you want to take a moment and respond to any of the comments, the floor is yours. It just kind of guides the discussion, and we'll talk about the paper for the next 15 minutes or so.
Thank you for all comments. That I think this is really helpful and exactly the thing that I was concerning about. So mostly about a theory section. So my theory is so decisive. So I have to see another possibilities in theory or kind of things. So, but the thing is, like here, the alliance with a great power, I think it's more about a given situation in my theory. So the main kind of variable which make variation is the military capability part. So forming alliance, okay, I formed an alliance with the United States, but the most important factors which make my counterpart mad is more about a military capability. So like increasing in a military capability might make the potential challenger worry more about their security. So that makes that kind of the logic happens in my theory. So I mean, yeah, but it is really true that forming alliance itself is really kind of selection that always inherently has selection problems. So like actually the way I thought was like using placebo test. I'm not sure whether it can kind of fix up the selection issues, but I'm struggling with what possible placebo test here in this context. So yeah, I mean, of course, matching. I read Michael Kenwick, the Dr. McManus paper on 2016 JOP. So it's the paper talking about a matching method. So other kind of tools. I mean, I'm still thinking which is better between the other matching or kind of things, causal inference tools, or just using the placebo test, which indirectly measure the causal inference kind of things. So I think that's one major concern before hearing this, before getting these comments today. But after getting the comments from you guys, I think the concern that I had before was not that severe. I think I have to dig into the theory section more. So yeah. So yeah, thank you for the comments. Anyway, yeah. And I totally agree with the point that this logic is not limited to the great power, but that if the alliance itself is the great power alliance or a symmetric alliance, then like as you see on the Middle East conflict, that Iran doesn't like the situation that the alliance between, of course, this is informal anyway, but this is alliance enemy. So the alliance between Israel and the United States getting stronger, and Iran doesn't want to see that situation. So in that situation, the United States, Israel is a lot easier target for the Iran compared to the United States. So Iran may prefer the situation to confront Israel rather than the United States. So I think that's really fair point. So it's not about a great power rivalry, but it's about that just rivalry between the challenger and the patron. So yeah, I think that's really great point. So I'll try to expand my data and theory into this in general form of the rivalry. So yeah.
I think Ashley has a hand up.
Thanks. So I think this maybe have been what you were alluding to, Chamseul, but I just want to encourage you to think about these selection problems not as things requiring an empirical fix, but as things to theorize about. So I don't think you're ever going to be able to convince people fully with an empirical strategy. I think there's certainly empirical strategies that will make it more convincing. And I think that if you're really clear about what you think what you think drives the differences in who's a protege and who's not a protege, then that will help you figure out what things you can do in terms of including potential confounders, things like that. But in the end, people need to be persuaded by the theory. More than any of these tests. So before you go out and try to figure out what the empirical solution is, I would really just think through what you'd really expect in this admittedly non-random sample of proteges.
Yeah, thank you. So for counting this selection problem, is it okay to show in theory section that this forming alliance or bolstering alliance or the challenger's reaction to that is not a selection, but the other direction also can be possible. So it's not a selection, but both way of the decision making can be possible. Is that you're saying?
I don't think that's exactly what I'm saying. I think, but I'm not sure. I think showing that selection effects could go both ways doesn't solve the problem because we don't know the frequency with which each of those two cases appears empirically, right? And so I think instead what you've got to do is you've got a theory here of how rivals are responding to alliances. What you don't have here is a theory of why that alliance exists in spite of what others are saying is anticipation that this is going to annoy the ally, right? And so in your motivating case, the US, like Roseanne said, that your motivating case, the US-South Korea alliance existed independent of a threat from China, right? I mean, the threat from China has grown, but initially it wasn't created because of a threat from China. If anything, it was from North Korea and Russia at the time, right? But in other cases, what we're seeing mostly in Asia is people thinking about, I've got China, I've got the US. What is it that I'm supposed to do in this circumstance? I don't want to annoy anybody. I want to be protected from everybody, right? And so I think thinking about what causes proteges to form these alliances in spite of the fact that they may then be threatened by the rival is, to me, seems important to the story. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. Thanks for clarification. Yeah.
Michael, go ahead.
I agree with everything that was just said. Just to build on it a little bit, that would be my next step. Would essentially be to look into your data and look at the instances of alliance formation and do some, good old-fashioned historical casework and find out what's happening. And I think that will A, provide you with some sense of what the general patterns in the data are, but then B, also be able to speak more theoretically about what the likely drivers are, what the risks of bias are. And I completely agree with Ashley that until you can diagnose what the problem is, any empirical solution will be A, unclear, and B, you have the typical limitations of you'll never reverse engineer randomness, of course, but if you do have those to play, that'll help. And just to kind of double up on that, it also had me thinking of, to rephrase my point with the relative capabilities, I kept on kind of trying to think of, well, what would be the case where you would actually need the interaction? What would be the great power alliance that wouldn't dramatically shift capabilities enough to change the logic? And I may be missing cases there too, because then I was trying to think of, some of the old Cold War examples, but I think short version of this comment would be, look through your data, look through what's happening. And then I think it's something I always do at some point, and that'll be a way to kind of combine deduction and induction and hopefully build a stronger theory.
I want to offer my strong endorsement of Michael's suggestion to sort of look into the cases. I think that'll have a variety of benefits. I think one thing it'll help you, I think it will help you think through the selection, right? To sort of see how these decision makers, like, what is their mental model of the situation that's going on? Like, I think your theory offers a reasonable mental model, but I think the important question that people are worried about with these selection considerations is that the correct mental model, right, that the decision makers have, and that's going to really help. And if you can incorporate some of that into the paper, Ashley's right. I think there's never, this is our world in IR, right? There's never really going to be a statistical fix that's going to make everyone happy, but I think that qualitative information can go a long way.
Let me just two-finger very quickly on that, which is, don't just look at cases where alliances were formed. That you have to look at some of the non-formed cases too. Why did states decide not to seek a great power ally?
Yes. Roseanne.
Yeah, just another two-finger. Another way that when you actually are working on writing up the paper and revising it again, another way that you can address selection concerns is you can actually, these cases that you've looked into, you can put one or two of them in the paper. You don't have to have like a long 20-page case, but you can have little anecdotes. I mean, like you already have for South Korea, but maybe have a couple more and go a little bit deeper into what exactly is going on there.
Jesse.
Along these lines, while we're talking about looking at the data, one of the things I didn't mention in my comments, because I didn't want to speak too long, was about like who these sanctioners are. I don't know the sanction data as well as some other people, but from what I know is, the United States makes up a big portion of these sanctioners, right? So the question is, what does this look like in your data, right? You give the story about China sanctioning South Korea, but are the rest just the United States sanctioning North Korea, right? I'm not sure. I would just like to know more cases where somebody got sanctioned by somebody's rival than just the South Korea example. And are they all just US cases, right? I think that's always the risk with sanction work. And so I think you have some work to do to alleviate those concerns as well. While you're in the data for the reasons Ashley and Michael and Roseanne are telling you about, I think that would be helpful as well.
Related to Jesse's point about thinking about how much of this is US driven, a minor comment that I had that I didn't offer in the interest of time is, I'm also curious about how much of this is NATO driven. Because I think, one aspect of your theory is that, sort of the major driving factor behind these sanctions in the theory is increases in something that looks like peacetime coordination among the allies. And my sense is that NATO drives a lot of that, probably, especially in the sample that you're using. And so it might be worth thinking about the degree to which that is contributing to the results. Getting close to time, so I'll offer a last call for thoughts.
I have one more thing I could say on the sanction side, briefly, which is one of the things that's notable is that you don't include threats of sanctions, only imposition of sanctions on the sanction side. Whereas I think a lot of people think about the low-level mids as including sort of threats of greater action rather than, whether that's empirically all included, I don't know, but I think that's a bit of an asymmetry there that you might want to think about in the long run, because I think that the people who worked on the threat and imposition of economic sanctions data set, Morgan and Babbitt and all of their co-authors, show that most of the effective sanctions is at the threat stage, not after they're imposed.
All right, Chamseul, are there any last comments, thoughts, responses that you wanted to offer? We've got about 3 minutes, so I want to make sure that everybody gets out of here on time.
Actually, I didn't expect to see these big names, but I really appreciate for your comments. So like, it's really, I feel this is really amazing that I saw all of your names on the articles, just on the articles, like when I wrote this papers. But yeah, I really appreciate that's my final vote. So thank you for the comments. I will try to reflect all of your comments well on the revision of this draft. So yeah, thank you for all the comments today.
Well, thank you, Chamseul, for giving an awesome paper. I'm really looking forward to seeing it out and citing it. And so I want to thank all of our discussants for the careful read of the paper. This was as always, an excellent session of the Online Peace Science Colloquium. So we're almost at time, so I think we should probably call it for today. So until next time, thanks everyone. See you next time.